Chapter 1. Wheels in the Snow. The snowstorm began as a whisper. Tiny flakes drifted from the gray sky, dancing on the wind like secrets waiting to be shared. Emma Daniels gripped the steering wheel of the caravan tightly, her knuckles white against the leather. The windshield wipers worked furiously to clear her view, but the road ahead was quickly disappearing beneath a thickening blanket of snow. In the passenger seat, her younger sister Natalie fiddled with the heater controls, her breath fogging the air. "Are you sure this is the right road?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. Emma didn't answer immediately. Her eyes flicked to the GPS screen, its glowing map showing their route winding through the mountains. The storm hadn't been in the forecast, and now they were caught in the middle of nowhere, miles from the next town. "It's the only road," Emma said finally, her voice calm but firm. "We'll just have to keep going." In the back of the caravan, Max, their younger brother, muttered under his breath as he rummaged through a bag. "We should have stopped when we had the chance," he said, loud enough for them to hear. Emma shot him a glare in the rearview mirror. "And sleep where, Max? In the middle of the woods? Better than sliding off a cliff," he retorted, his tone edged with frustration. "Enough," Natalie interjected, her hands raised in mock surrender. "Let's just focus on getting through this, okay?" The tension in the caravan was as thick as the snow outside. The holiday trip had been Emma's idea, a chance to reconnect as a family after a year that had pulled them in different directions. Now, it felt like a mistake. The snow continued to fall, heavier now, and the road narrowed as they climbed higher into the mountains. The trees on either side of the road stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with ice. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the caravan's frame. And then, the engine sputtered. Emma's heart sank as the caravan jerked and slowed, the tires crunching to a halt in the snow. She turned the key again, but the engine groaned in protest before falling silent. "Tell me that didn't just happen," Natalie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma didn't respond. She stepped out into the storm, the cold biting at her face as she popped the hood. A quick glance told her everything she needed to know. Whatever had gone wrong was beyond her ability to fix. Max and Natalie joined her outside, their faces pale in the dim light. "Great," Max said, his breath puffing in the icy air. "Now what?" "We walk," Emma said, her voice resolute. "We passed a sign for a cabin rental about a mile back. Maybe someone's there who can help." Max looked like he wanted to argue, but Natalie was already pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. "Let's go," she said, her tone leaving no room for debate. The three of them set off into the snow, the wind howling around them like a living thing. The forest loomed on either side of the road, dark and foreboding, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sign appeared out of the storm like a ghost, its wooden frame nearly buried in snow. "Evergreen Cabins. Warmth and welcome await you," it read, the letters faded but legible. An arrow pointed toward a narrow trail winding into the woods. "This is it," Emma said, her voice muffled by her scarf. She led the way, her boots sinking into the fresh snow with each step. The trail was barely visible, and the trees pressed closer as they moved deeper into the forest. The storm seemed quieter here, the wind muffled by the thick canopy of branches overhead. "Are we sure this is safe?" Max asked, his voice laced with unease. "No," Emma admitted, "but it's better than freezing to death." After what felt like an eternity, the cabin came into view. It stood in a small clearing, its roof and porch blanketed in snow. Warm light spilled from the windows, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney. "It's perfect," Natalie said, her relief palpable. Emma wasn't so sure. Something about the cabin felt wrong. It was too perfect, too welcoming, like it had been waiting for them. But she pushed the thought aside and stepped onto the porch, her boots echoing against the wooden planks. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the cabin was warm and inviting, the fire crackling in the hearth and a pot of something fragrant simmering on the stove. The furniture was simple but comfortable, and a Christmas tree stood in the corner, its twinkling lights casting a soft glow. "Hello?" Emma called, her voice hesitant. There was no answer. Natalie and Max followed her inside, their expressions mirroring her unease. "Maybe they're out," Natalie suggested. "In this storm?" Max said skeptically. Emma moved further into the cabin, her eyes scanning every detail. A table was set for 3, complete with steaming mugs of cocoa and plates of cookies dusted with powdered sugar. "This doesn't feel right," she said, her voice low. "Does it matter?" Natalie said, already peeling off her gloves. "We're here, and it's warm. Let's just be grateful." Max stayed near the door, his eyes darting toward the darkened windows. "I don't like this," he muttered. Emma ignored him and approached the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth. But as she stood there, a noise caught her attention, a faint creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. She turned sharply, her heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" Natalie looked up from her cocoa, her brow furrowed. "Hear what?" Emma's gaze swept the room, but everything was as it had been moments before. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. "Maybe it's the storm," Max said, though he didn't sound convinced. Emma wasn't convinced either, but she kept her thoughts to herself as she sat down at the table, her unease growing with every passing moment. The cabin was warm, inviting, and perfect. Too perfect. And as the storm raged on outside, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were exactly where someone wanted them to be. Chapter 2. A Map Without Directions. The storm pressed against the cabin like an insistent guest, howling through the trees and rattling the window panes. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, its warmth reaching every corner of the room. Yet for Emma, Natalie, and Max, the cabin's comfort only deepened the strange sense of unease that clung to the air. Emma sat near the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames as they danced and flickered. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of cocoa that she hadn't touched. Natalie had found a blanket and was curled up in an armchair, her face flushed from the heat. Max lingered by the window, peering into the swirling snow as though searching for something or someone. "It's just a cabin," Natalie said, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "People rent these out all the time. There's no reason to act like it's haunted." Emma glanced at her, noting the way her sister's voice wavered ever so slightly. "I didn't say it was haunted," she replied. "But don't you think it's odd? A fire burning, food on the table, and no one here?" "Maybe they stepped out before the storm got worse," Natalie suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "In the middle of nowhere?" Max said, turning from the window. "Without even locking the door?" Natalie sighed, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "We don't have many options, do we? Unless you want to go back out there and freeze to death." Max opened his mouth to argue, but Emma held up a hand. "Enough," she said firmly. "We'll stay here for now, but we need to be cautious." They lapsed into silence again, the storm outside the only sound. After a while, Emma stood and began to explore the cabin. It wasn't large, just a single main room with a small kitchen, a bathroom tucked into one corner, and a narrow staircase leading to what she assumed was a loft. Everything was tidy, almost unnaturally so. The wooden floors were polished to a shine, and not a single speck of dust clung to the furniture. Her gaze landed on the Christmas tree in the corner. It was adorned with delicate ornaments and garlands of gold and silver, its twinkling lights casting a soft glow. Beneath it, a handful of wrapped presents sat neatly arranged. Emma crouched down, reaching out to touch one of the packages. The paper was smooth and cold, the edges perfectly creased. She turned it over, searching for a tag, but there was none. Find anything interesting? Max's voice startled her, and she nearly dropped the box. Just these, she said, gesturing to the presents. Max frowned. Who leaves unopened gifts in a cabin they're not even in? Emma didn't answer. Instead, she set the box back down and stood, brushing her hands against her jeans. I'm going upstairs, she said. I'll come with you, Max offered immediately. Natalie rolled her eyes. You two are being ridiculous, she muttered. But she stayed in her chair, pulling the blanket over her head. The stairs creaked under their weight as Emma and Max climbed to the loft. The air grew cooler as they ascended, and the faint scent of pine lingered in the air. The loft was small, just a single room with a sloped ceiling and a bed pushed against the far wall. A quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed, and a lamp sat on a nearby table. Emma walked to the window, which overlooked the snowy forest. The storm had eased slightly, and she could make out the dark shapes of trees swaying in the wind. Max moved to the bed, running a hand over the quilt. Looks like no one slept here in a while, he said. Emma nodded, her gaze distant. Something about the cabin's pristine condition unsettled her. It felt less like a place where people lived and more like a stage, carefully arranged and waiting for an audience. We should go back down, she said finally. Max agreed, and they descended the stairs. Back in the main room, Natalie had fallen asleep, her breathing soft and steady. Emma glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. We should take shifts, she said quietly to Max. Good idea, he replied. You go first. I'll wake you in a few hours. Emma nodded, settling into the armchair opposite Natalie. Max stoked the fire before returning to his post by the window. The hours stretched on, the cabin eerily quiet. Emma tried to stay alert, but the warmth of the fire and the rhythm of the storm outside lulled her into a daze. Her eyes drifted shut, and she dreamed of shadows moving in the snow, their whispers faint but insistent. When she woke, the fire had burned low, and the cabin was dark. Max? She called softly, but there was no response. Panic flared in her chest as she stood and looked around. Natalie was still in the chair, her blanket rising and falling with each breath, but Max was nowhere to be seen. Emma hurried to the window, peering out into the night. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a thick layer of snow. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. And there, in the clearing, were footprints. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the forest. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The tracks were fresh, too fresh. Grabbing her coat, she threw it on and stepped outside, the cold biting at her skin. She followed the footprints, her heart pounding with each step. Max, she called, her voice trembling. The forest loomed around her, its silence oppressive. The tracks led deeper and deeper into the woods, twisting and turning as though their maker had no clear destination. Finally, Emma came to a stop. The footprints ended abruptly, as though the person had simply vanished. A sudden noise behind her made her spin around, her pulse racing, but there was nothing there. Nothing but shadows. Chapter 3: Ghosts of Christmas Past. The forest was alive with silence. Snow hung heavily on the branches above, muffling the sound of Emma's footsteps as she trudged back toward the cabin. Her breath fogged the air, and every shadow seemed to shift in the pale moonlight. The trail of footprints she had followed to the abrupt end still lingered in her mind, an impossible mystery she couldn't solve. She glanced back once more before the cabin came into view, its windows glowing like warm eyes in the night. Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. Max was still missing. Inside, Natalie stirred as Emma entered, brushing snow from her coat. "Where were you?" Natalie murmured groggily, sitting up and clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Emma hesitated. Looking for Max, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Natalie frowned, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Looking for him? What do you mean? He was. Her sentence broke off as her gaze swept the room. Wait, where is he? I don't know, Emma admitted, moving toward the fire to rekindle the dying flames. She poked at the embers with a poker, watching sparks flare up before settling again. When I woke up, he was gone. I found footprints outside, but they just stopped, like he vanished. Natalie's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. Vanished? Emma, what are you saying? I don't know, Emma repeated, frustration bubbling in her voice. But we can't just sit here. If Max is out there. A sudden knock at the door cut her off. Both women froze, staring at the wooden door as the sound echoed in the cabin. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by silence. Emma exchanged a look with Natalie, then grabbed the poker from the fireplace. Slowly, she approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Who's there? She called, her voice firmer than she felt. There was no answer. Swallowing hard, Emma pulled the door open. The icy wind rushed in, carrying with it a flurry of snow. But no one stood on the porch. Instead, a lantern hung from the wooden railing, its flame flickering steadily despite the breeze. What the? Natalie's voice trailed off as she joined Emma at the door. Emma stepped out onto the porch, the snow crunching under her boots. She reached for the lantern, lifting it from the hook. The glass was warm to the touch, as though it had been lit only moments ago. That wasn't there before, Natalie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma shook her head, scanning the forest. The snow-covered ground was untouched, no footprints leading to or from the cabin. Yet the lantern burned brightly, its light casting long, twisting shadows across the snow. As Emma turned back toward the door, she noticed something else. Another lantern, faintly glowing in the distance, just beyond the edge of the forest. Do you see that? She asked, pointing toward the light. Natalie squinted, then nodded. It's another lantern. But why? I think it's a trail, Emma said, her mind racing. Someone's leading us somewhere. Natalie grabbed her arm. Emma, wait. This is insane. Max could be anywhere, and this feels like a trap. Emma hesitated, her heart pounding. She knew Natalie was right, but the alternative, staying in the cabin and doing nothing, felt just as dangerous. I can't ignore it, she said finally. Max is out there, and this might be the only way to find him. Natalie sighed, her grip tightening. Then I'm coming with you. Emma nodded, handing Natalie a flashlight before stepping off the porch. Together, they followed the faint glow of the lanterns, their breaths clouding the air as they moved deeper into the forest. The trail was eerily precise. Each lantern hung from a low branch, its flames steady and bright. The snow around them was untouched, as if no one had passed through to place them. What kind of person does this? Natalie muttered, her voice cutting through the quiet. I don't know, Emma admitted, her eyes scanning the shadows. But whoever it is, they want us to follow. The forest grew darker as they continued, the lanterns casting just enough light to guide their way. Emma's thoughts churned with questions. Who had placed the lanterns? Where was Max? And why did the forest feel so alive? After what felt like hours, the trail led them to a clearing. In the center stood a small, weathered gazebo, its roof heavy with snow. A final lantern hung from its center, casting a golden glow over the structure. Emma approached cautiously, her boots sinking into the deep snow. As she stepped into the gazebo, she noticed something lying on the wooden floor. Max's scarf, damp and frayed at the edges. She picked it up, her stomach twisting. He was here, she said, her voice trembling. Natalie joined her, her eyes wide with fear. But where is he now? Before Emma could answer, a sound echoed through the forest, a low, mournful whistle, like the wind passing through a hollow tree. It was followed by the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow. Emma and Natalie froze, their breaths caught in their throats. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to surround the clearing. Shadows moved at the edges of the lantern light, shifting and merging like smoke. "Who's there?" Emma called, her voice strong despite the fear clawing at her chest. The shadows stilled, and for a moment, the forest was silent again. Then, a voice whispered from the darkness, low and chilling. "You shouldn't have come." Chapter 4. The Stranger with the Camera. The voice lingered in the cold night air, its weight pressing down on Emma and Natalie like a tangible force. They stood frozen in the gazebo, surrounded by shadows that seemed to breathe, the flickering lantern above casting erratic, trembling light across their faces. "Did you hear that?" Natalie whispered, clutching Emma's arm. Emma didn't respond. Her mind raced as her gaze swept the forest, searching for the source of the voice. The shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed alive, shifting and curling like tendrils of smoke. A chill ran down her spine. "We need to leave," she said, her voice low but firm. Natalie nodded, but neither of them moved. Fear rooted them to the spot, their breaths coming in short, shallow bursts. Then, from somewhere deep within the woods, a faint sound echoed, the distant jingle of bells. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second, the rhythm uneven and haunting. "What is that?" Natalie asked, her voice barely audible. Emma shook her head, gripping Max's scarf tightly in her hand. "I don't know," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "But we're not staying to find out." She grabbed Natalie's hand and pulled her toward the trail of lanterns. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they ran, their breaths puffing in the icy air. The jingling bells followed them, their eerie melody weaving through the trees like a living thing. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier. The once clear trail of lanterns seemed to twist and shift, leading them in circles. Emma's heart pounded as she tried to focus, her mind replaying the whispered warning from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." "Emma, stop," Natalie cried, yanking her hand free. Emma skidded to a halt, nearly slipping on the icy ground. She turned to see Natalie staring at something ahead, her face pale. Following her gaze, Emma saw it too. The lanterns they had followed had led them back to the clearing. The gazebo stood before them, the same lantern flickering above, casting its sinister light. "This isn't possible," Emma murmured, her voice shaking. Natalie turned to her, eyes wide with panic. "We've been walking straight. How are we back here?" Emma didn't have an answer. The forest seemed to hum around them, a low, vibrating sound that made her teeth ache. She gritted her teeth and clenched her fists, forcing herself to think. "We need to try another direction," she said. "Come on." But as they turned to leave, the jingling bells grew louder, accompanied by a new sound, the crunch of snow underfoot. Emma froze, her pulse racing. "Do you hear that?" Natalie nodded, her face pale. "Someone's coming." The shadows at the edge of the clearing began to move again, shifting and stretching like ink spilled across paper. A figure emerged, its outline blurry and indistinct in the dim light. It moved slowly, deliberately, the sound of its footsteps echoing in the stillness. "Hello?" Emma called, her voice trembling but strong. The figure didn't respond. It stopped at the edge of the light, just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. Emma took a cautious step forward, her breath catching in her throat. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, as if studying her. Then, in a voice that was both familiar and foreign, it spoke. Emma. She froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was Max's. Max? She said, her heart leaping. She took another step forward, squinting to see the figure more clearly. Max, is that you? The figure didn't move. Its outline wavered, as though it were made of smoke and light, and its voice came again, softer this time. Emma, why did you come? Tears sprang to her eyes as she moved closer, ignoring Natalie's panicked whispers to stop. Max, I've been looking for you. Where have you been? The figure raised a hand, its movements slow and deliberate. For a moment, Emma thought it would reach for her, but instead, it pointed toward the forest. Go back, it said, its voice hollow and echoing. You don't belong here. Before Emma could respond, the figure dissolved into the shadows, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a breeze. No, she cried, running forward, but there was nothing left, only the dark, empty forest. Natalie grabbed her arm, pulling her back. Emma, we have to go. This place, it's not right. Emma nodded reluctantly, her chest tight with fear and frustration. We'll follow the lanterns again, she said, her voice shaking. But this time, we'll be smarter. We'll mark the trees so we know if we're going in circles. Natalie hesitated, then nodded. Together, they found the first lantern and began walking, Emma using a piece of charcoal from her pocket to mark each tree they passed. The forest seemed to fight them at every turn. The air grew colder, the snow deeper. The jingling bells continued to follow them, their uneven rhythm maddening. After what felt like hours, Emma noticed something strange. The marks she had made on the trees were gone. She stopped, staring at the unmarked trunk before her. This can't be happening, she whispered. Natalie stepped closer, her face pale. What's wrong? Emma pointed to the tree. I marked this. I know I did. But it's gone. Natalie's eyes widened, and she glanced around nervously. Emma, I don't think we're meant to leave. As the realization sank in, the forest grew darker, the lantern light dimming until it was little more than a faint glow. The jingling bells grew louder, and with them came a voice, low and mournful. Stay. Emma turned to Natalie, her heart pounding. Run. But as they tried to flee, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and stretching like living things. The ground beneath their feet shifted, and the air grew heavy with the scent of pine and smoke. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. Emma and Natalie found themselves standing in a clearing. This time, not the gazebo, but something else. A towering pine tree stood before them, its branches heavy with ornaments that glowed faintly in the darkness. Beneath it, a figure knelt in the snow. Emma's breath caught as she recognized him. Mac. He turned to face her, his expression blank, his eyes filled with something she couldn't name. You shouldn't have come, he said, his voice a whisper that echoed through the trees. Chapter 5. Lights flickering in the distance. The towering pine loomed above them, its branches stretched wide like skeletal arms, the faint glow of ornaments flickering like captive stars. Emma stood frozen, staring at Max as he knelt in the snow beneath the tree, his face pale and expressionless. Max, she whispered, her voice cracking. She took a hesitant step forward, but her boots sank deep into the snow, as if the forest itself was trying to hold her back. Max raised his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. They were hollow, clouded with an emptiness that sent a shiver down her spine. You shouldn't have followed, he said, his voice low and detached, as though it wasn't entirely his own. Emma's heart ached at the sight of him. Max, it's me, she said, her voice trembling. We've been searching for you. What happened? Where have you been? He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the glowing ornaments on the tree. They pulsed faintly, as if in rhythm with his breathing. "This place doesn't let go," Max finally said, his tone laced with both warning and resignation. Natalie, standing just behind Emma, spoke up, her voice trembling. "What do you mean? What is this place?" Max lowered his head, his hands sinking into the snow. "It's a threshold," he said, "a place caught between, where time and space twist. Once you're here," he trailed off, his shoulders sagging. "No," Emma said firmly, stepping closer despite the weight of the air pressing against her. "We're not leaving without you. We'll find a way out, together." Max shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. The forest doesn't let anyone leave. It's alive, Emma. It decides who stays and who—" His voice faltered, and he looked away. Emma knelt beside him, gripping his arm. "I don't care what this place is. You're coming back with us." For a moment, Max seemed to soften. His eyes met hers, and she saw a flicker of the man she knew. But then, a shadow passed over his face, and he pulled away. "You shouldn't have come," he repeated, more forcefully this time. Before Emma could respond, the tree behind them groaned, its branches rustling though there was no wind. The ornaments glowed brighter, their light casting eerie, shifting patterns across the snow. Natalie gasped, clutching Emma's arm. "Something's happening." The ground beneath them trembled, a low rumble rising from deep within the earth. Emma stood, pulling Max to his feet. "We have to go." Max resisted, shaking his head. "It won't let us. It's already chosen." "Chosen what?" Emma demanded, her voice rising in frustration. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the edge of the clearing. Shadows moved there, darker than the night itself, shifting and curling as they crept closer. The jingling of bells returned, louder and more erratic, accompanied by a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Natalie clung to Emma, her voice barely a whisper. "What is that?" Max's expression was grim. "It's the forest." The shadows moved faster now, circling the clearing, their forms twisting into shapes that were almost human but not quite. Their eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly, mirroring the light of the ornaments. "Run," Max said suddenly, his voice sharp and commanding. Emma hesitated, her mind racing. "Not without you." "Go," he shouted, pushing her toward Natalie. "I'll distract them. You need to follow the lights." Natalie grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her back. "Emma, we have to go." Tears filled Emma's eyes as she looked at Max. "I'll come back for you," she promised. He gave her a faint, sad smile. "Don't." Before she could argue, the ground shook violently, and the shadows surged forward, their forms stretching and merging like liquid smoke. Max turned to face them, his stance firm, his hands clenched into fists. "Go," he yelled one last time. Natalie dragged Emma away, and together they ran, following the faint glow of lanterns that appeared in the distance. The forest seemed to shift around them, the trees twisting and bending as if trying to trap them. The jingling bells grew fainter, replaced by the sound of rushing wind and distant whispers. Emma's thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and determination. She couldn't leave Max behind, not again. But the forest was relentless, its presence pressing down on them like a physical weight. After what felt like hours of running, they stumbled into another clearing. This one was smaller, the ground bare and frozen. A single lantern hung from a low branch, its light flickering weakly. Natalie collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. "What now?" she panted. Emma looked around, her mind racing. The whispers had grown louder, almost deafening, but there was no sign of the shadows or Max. "We keep going," she said, her voice firm. Natalie looked up at her, tears streaming down her face. "Emma, we're lost." He said the forest wouldn't let us leave. Emma knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. "We can't give up. Max is still out there. We'll find him, and we'll find a way out." As if in response, the lantern's flame flared brightly for a moment, then dimmed. The whispers faded, leaving the clearing in an eerie silence. Emma stood, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't stop until she brought Max home. With Natalie at her side, she stepped into the shadows once more, the flickering light of the lantern guiding their way. Chapter 6: Crossroads Under the Stars. The flickering light of the lantern cast long, distorted shadows as Emma and Natalie pressed deeper into the forest. The snow crunched beneath their boots, its sound muffled by the oppressive silence that had replaced the earlier cacophony. The air was heavy, carrying a strange metallic tang that made Emma's throat dry. "Do you think he's still alive?" Natalie asked, her voice shaky. She clutched her arms around her body, her breath coming in uneven bursts. Emma didn't answer immediately. Her mind was consumed with the image of Max standing beneath the pine, his face a blend of defiance and despair. She couldn't afford to think otherwise. "He's alive," she said firmly, gripping the scarf still tied around her wrist. "We'll find him." The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the trees growing denser and darker. The lantern they followed swayed gently on its branch, its light dim and uncertain, as if it too were hesitant about their path. Natalie stopped abruptly, grabbing Emma's arm. "Wait." Emma turned, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" Natalie pointed to the ground. At first, Emma didn't see it, but then her eyes adjusted to the faint glow of the lantern. There, in the snow, were footprints, large, heavy, and not their own. "They're fresh," Natalie whispered, her voice trembling. Emma knelt to examine them, her fingers brushing the indentations. The prints were deep, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them carried significant weight. They led off the path, into the thicker part of the forest, where the light of the lantern barely reached. "We should keep going," Natalie urged, pulling Emma back. "The lantern's this way. We can't get distracted." Emma hesitated. The footprints were a clue, possibly the only clue they'd found since entering this nightmarish place. But the lantern's path had been their only guide, however uncertain. "We don't know where this leads," Natalie added, her voice rising with fear. "And you saw those shadows, Emma. What if it's one of them?" Emma stood, her jaw tightening. She glanced at the lantern swaying on the trail ahead, then back at the footprints disappearing into the darkness. Her heart pounded as she weighed the choices. "We follow the footprints," she said finally. Natalie's eyes widened. "Are you serious? You want to leave the lantern's path?" Emma nodded. "Whoever made these prints, they might know something. Or it could be Mac." Natalie groaned but didn't argue further. Together, they stepped off the path, the forest swallowing them as they moved deeper into the shadows. The air grew colder, biting at their skin, and the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for them. Emma kept her eyes on the footprints, her breath fogging in the icy air. "Do you hear that?" Natalie whispered. Emma stopped, straining to listen. At first, there was only the faint rustle of branches, but then she heard it, a low, guttural sound, like the growl of an animal. Her stomach tightened. "Stay close," she said, gripping Natalie's hand. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. Emma's heart raced as she turned in every direction, trying to pinpoint the source. Suddenly, the lantern they'd left behind flared brightly in the distance, its light cutting through the darkness. For a moment, Emma thought it was guiding them back. But then the light shifted, moving toward them at an unnaturally fast pace. "Run!" Emma shouted, pulling Natalie with her. They sprinted through the forest, the snow dragging at their feet, and the trees clawing at their clothes. The lantern's light grew closer, its glow sharp and menacing, casting eerie shadows that danced like specters around them. Emma's lungs burned as they ran, her mind racing. The footprints had vanished, swallowed by the snow, and now there was only the suffocating darkness and the relentless light chasing them. "Emma, we can't keep running," Natalie cried, stumbling behind her. Emma skidded to a halt, dragging Natalie into a hollow beneath a fallen tree. They crouched there, their breaths ragged, as the lantern's light passed overhead, searching like a predator stalking its prey. The growl returned, louder now, and with it came a figure, tall and broad, its form obscured by the shifting shadows. It moved with a jerking, unnatural gait, the light of the lantern casting its features in stark relief. Emma's breath caught as she recognized the face. It wasn't Max. The figure was a man, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and lifeless. A tattered coat hung from his shoulders, and his hands, long and claw-like, clutched a lantern identical to the one they'd followed. His head swiveled unnaturally, scanning the forest with an eerie precision. Natalie clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. Emma held her breath, her heart pounding as the man stepped closer, his boots crunching in the snow. He stopped just a few feet from their hiding place, his lantern swinging gently in his grasp. Then, as if sensing their presence, he tilted his head, his empty gaze locking onto the hollow. Emma's pulse raced. She gripped a branch beside her, ready to defend them if necessary. But the man didn't move. Instead, he spoke, his voice low and hollow. "You don't belong here." The words sent a chill down Emma's spine. She stayed perfectly still, watching as the man turned slowly and disappeared into the shadows, his lantern's light fading with him. When he was gone, Emma let out a shaky breath, her body trembling. "What was that?" Natalie whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Emma said, her voice shaking, "but we need to keep moving." They crawled out of the hollow and started walking again, the forest eerily silent around them. Emma's mind raced as she replayed the encounter. The man's words echoed in her ears. "You don't belong here." The lantern's betrayal, the shifting shadows, the man with the empty eyes. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't solve. But one thing was clear. The forest was testing them, and it wasn't done yet. As they pressed on, Emma tightened her grip on Max's scarf. She wouldn't give up. Not until she found him. Chapter 7. Secrets Beneath the Tinsel. The forest had grown quieter, an oppressive stillness that seemed to press down on Emma and Natalie as they trudged forward. The air, once sharp with winter's chill, now felt heavy and damp, clinging to their skin like a veil. Snowflakes fell softly, their descent eerily slow, as though time itself had begun to falter. Emma's legs burned with every step, her exhaustion a constant companion. She stole a glance at Natalie, whose face was pale and drawn, her eyes darting nervously toward every rustling branch and flickering shadow. "We need to stop," Natalie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma hesitated, scanning the surroundings. The trees here were taller, their branches arching overhead to form a canopy that blotted out the sky. Faint glimmers of light danced through the gaps, but they seemed unnatural, shifting and pulsing as if alive. "Just for a moment," Emma relented. They settled at the base of a massive oak, its gnarled roots twisting out of the frozen ground like a clawed hand. Emma leaned against the trunk, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Natalie sank into the snow, wrapping her arms around her knees. "Do you even know where we're going?" Emma didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the scarf tied around her wrist, its frayed edges a painful reminder of Max's absence. "We're going forward," she said finally. "There's nothing else we can do." Natalie let out a hollow laugh. Forward to what? More shadows? More of those things. She shuddered, burying her face in her hands. Before Emma could respond, a sound broke the silence, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It was indistinct at first, a murmur that could have been mistaken for the rustling of leaves. But as it grew louder, it became unmistakable. Voices. Emma shot to her feet, her heart pounding. Do you hear that? Natalie nodded, her face pale. What is it? The whispers surrounded them, rising and falling like a ghostly chant. They seemed to come from every direction, yet nowhere at all. Emma strained to make out the words, but they were fragmented, slipping through her grasp like water through cupped hands. Lost, return, choose. A shiver ran down her spine. We need to move, she said, grabbing Natalie's arm. Natalie resisted. Wait, what if it's someone trying to help us? Emma frowned. The idea was absurd, but the desperation in Natalie's voice gave her pause. Could there be others trapped in the forest, just like them? The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though sensing their hesitation. Then, without warning, the trees ahead parted, revealing a clearing bathed in pale, silvery light. Emma and Natalie exchanged a wary glance. The clearing was unervingly perfect, its circular shape bordered by evenly spaced trees that stood unnaturally still. At its center was a stone pedestal, weathered and cracked, with a lantern resting atop it. That can't be real, Natalie whispered, her voice trembling. Emma felt the same unease. The lantern's flame burned steady and bright, its glow pulsing faintly in rhythm with the whispers. It was unlike any of the lanterns they had followed before, its light warmer, almost inviting. I don't trust it, Emma said. But what if it's the way out? Natalie countered, her eyes fixed on the pedestal. Emma hesitated. The forest had played tricks on them before, leading them deeper into its clutches with false promises. But the clearing felt different. The oppressive weight of the trees seemed to have lifted, and the air was strangely calm. Well, look, Emma said finally. But be careful. They stepped into the clearing, the snow crunching softly beneath their boots. The whispers grew softer, almost reverent, as if watching their every move. As they approached the pedestal, Emma noticed strange carvings on its surface, symbols she didn't recognize, etched deep into the stone. They seemed to pulse faintly, their lines glowing in time with the lantern's light. Do you think it's a trap? Natalie asked, her voice barely audible. Emma didn't answer. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the pedestal. The moment she touched it, a wave of warmth coursed through her, chasing away the chill in her bones. Emma! Natalie cried. Emma staggered back, clutching her hand. The lantern's flame flared brightly, and the whispers surged, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a chaotic chant. The ground beneath them trembled, and the snow swirled upward, forming a vortex around the pedestal. Emma shielded her face, her mind racing. We need to get out of here, she shouted. But Natalie didn't move. She stood frozen, her eyes wide as she stared at the swirling snow. Emma, she whispered, her voice hollow. Look. Emma followed her gaze. Through the vortex, shapes began to form, familiar shapes. Faces. Max? Emma's voice broke as she stepped closer, her heart leaping at the sight of him. He stood just beyond the pedestal, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. Beside him were other figures, their faces blurry and indistinct, but unmistakably human. Help us, Max said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the vortex. Emma reached out, her fingers trembling. Max! But as she stepped closer, the ground gave way beneath her. She fell to her knees, the snow pulling at her like quicksand. Natalie screamed, grabbing her arm and pulling with all her strength. "Emma, don't," Natalie cried. The figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the swirling snow. Max's gaze locked with Emma's, his expression a mix of desperation and sorrow. "Go back," he mouthed. Emma's heart shattered as the vortex collapsed, the clearing plunging into darkness. The pedestal and lantern were gone, leaving only an empty expanse of snow. Natalie pulled Emma to her feet, her breaths ragged. What just happened? Emma stared at the spot where Max had stood, her mind reeling. She tightened her grip on the scarf, her resolve hardening. "I don't know," she said, her voice steady, "but we're getting him back." The forest seemed to sigh around them, the whispers fading into silence as they stepped back into the shadows. Emma didn't look back. She couldn't. Chapter 8: Detours and Discoveries. The forest was darker than ever. The trees, once stark silhouettes against the moonlight, now seemed to merge into a single, suffocating mass of blackness. Emma and Natalie trudged onward, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Every step felt heavier, the snow beneath their feet pulling at them like an anchor. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying faint echoes that made Emma's skin crawl. She couldn't tell if the whispers were real or her imagination, but they sounded like voices, familiar voices. "Emma." She froze mid-step, her heart skipping a beat. The voice had been clear, unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" she asked, glancing at Natalie. Natalie nodded, her face pale. "It said my name." Emma's stomach tightened. She scanned the trees, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but nothing moved. "Keep walking," she said, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her chest. Natalie didn't argue. They pressed forward, the whispers growing louder with each step. The voices overlapped now, creating a chilling symphony of half-formed words and broken pleas. "Help, lost, stay." Emma tried to block them out, focusing on the path ahead, but the voices were relentless. They seemed to burrow into her mind, tugging at memories she hadn't thought about in years. Her father's laughter, warm and rich. Her mother's voice, humming a lullaby. Max's teasing grin when he stole her scarf that morning. "Stop," she muttered, shaking her head as if to dislodge the thoughts. "What?" Natalie asked, her voice trembling. "Nothing. Just keep moving." They came to a clearing, smaller than the last, its edges marked by ancient stones jutting out of the snow like jagged teeth. The stones were carved with symbols similar to those on the pedestal, their surfaces worn smooth by time. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal arms. The tree's bark was blackened, as if scorched by fire, and its roots twisted into the ground, forming a labyrinthine pattern that made Emma's head spin if she looked too long. The whispers stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, pressing against Emma's ears like a physical weight. She exchanged a glance with Natalie, whose wide eyes reflected her own unease. "What is this place?" Natalie whispered. Emma didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the tree, her instinct screaming at her to turn back. But something about the tree drew her in, like a moth to a flame. As if in a trance, she stepped closer, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. Natalie grabbed her arm. "Emma, don't," she pleaded. "I have to," Emma said, her voice distant. She approached the tree, her heart pounding. The air around it was warmer, a stark contrast to the freezing forest. The warmth was oppressive, almost suffocating, but Emma couldn't stop herself. Her hand reached out, trembling, and touched the bark. A jolt of energy shot through her, and the world around her dissolved. Emma found herself standing in a room she hadn't seen in years. It was her childhood bedroom, exactly as she remembered it. The faded pink wallpaper, the bed covered in stuffed animals, the bookshelf overflowing with her favorite stories. She turned in a slow circle, her heart racing. "This isn't real," she whispered. But it felt real. The scent of lavender from the diffuser on her nightstand. The soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. A voice behind her made her spin around. "Emma." Her breath caught in her throat. It was her father, standing in the doorway, his familiar smile warming her from the inside out. "Dad," she choked out, tears springing to her eyes. He stepped toward her, his arms open. "I've missed you so much." Emma's instinct screamed at her to run, but her heart ached to embrace him. She took a tentative step forward. "Emma." The shout snapped her out of the trance. It was Natalie's voice, distant and faint. Emma blinked, and the room wavered like a mirage. Her father's smile faltered, and his eyes darkened, their warmth replaced by something cold and empty. "This isn't real," she said, stepping back. Her father's form twisted, his features melting and reforming into something grotesque. The room dissolved around her, replaced by the dark forest and the blackened tree. Emma stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. Natalie was at her side, gripping her arm. "What happened?" Natalie demanded. Emma shook her head, struggling to find words. "It showed me something. My past." Natalie frowned, her eyes darting to the tree. "We need to get out of here. Now." Before Emma could respond, the tree groaned, its branches creaking as they moved. The roots shifted, tearing through the snow and forming a barrier around the clearing. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The stones around the clearing began to glow, their symbols pulsating with a sickly green light. "We're trapped," Natalie said, her voice rising in panic. Emma's mind raced. The tree was alive, a malevolent force that fed on memories, on pain. She could feel its pull, tugging at her deepest fears and regrets. "No," Emma said, her voice firm. "We're not trapped." She grabbed a fallen branch and lit it with the lighter she always carried in her pocket. The flame flared bright in the darkness, and she held it aloft, stepping toward the tree. "What are you doing?" Natalie shouted. "Ending this," Emma said. The tree's groaning grew louder, its branches flailing as if trying to swat her away. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony that made Emma's ears ring. She thrust the flaming branch against the bark. The fire caught instantly, spreading with unnatural speed. The tree writhed, its roots thrashing against the ground. "Run!" Emma shouted, grabbing Natalie's hand. They sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, the flames consuming the tree behind them. The glowing stones shattered, their light extinguished. As they broke through the barrier of roots, the forest seemed to sigh, its oppressive weight lifting. The air was cold again, the snow falling softly around them. Emma collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving. Natalie knelt beside her, her face pale but relieved. "What was that?" Natalie asked. Emma shook her head. "I don't know, but whatever it was, it's gone now." They sat in silence, the forest quiet around them. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the tree had only been the beginning. The path ahead would be even darker, and the shadows would not give up so easily. Chapter 9. Echoes from the Heart. The forest felt different now, though not in a way that brought relief. The oppressive weight of the trees had lifted, but in its place lingered an eerie stillness. Snow no longer fell, the air hung stagnant, and even the distant cries of unseen creatures had vanished. It was as though the forest was holding its breath, watching, waiting. Emma and Natalie trudged forward in silence. The flames that had consumed the blackened tree were long behind them, but the memory of its groaning branches and glowing roots clung to Emma like a second skin. She could still hear the whispers in the back of her mind, faint but persistent, as though the forest refused to let her forget. Natalie walked a few steps ahead, her shoulders hunched against the cold. She hadn't spoken much since they'd fled the clearing, her face tight with fear and exhaustion. Emma wanted to say something to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. Ahead, the path narrowed, flanked by steep embankments of snow that rose like walls on either side. Emma hesitated, her instincts prickling. The narrowness felt like a trap, an invitation to be cornered. "Do you think this leads anywhere?" Natalie asked, her voice hoarse. Emma scanned the path, her eyes narrowing. Only one way to find out. They pressed on, the snow crunching beneath their boots the only sound in the unnatural silence. The embankments grew taller, their icy walls glinting faintly in the dim light. The air grew colder, each breath cutting like shards of glass in Emma's lungs. As they walked, Emma noticed strange markings in the snow. Patterns that looked almost like footprints, but were too large and too irregular to belong to any human or animal she knew. They crisscrossed the path, some disappearing into the embankments while others seemed to emerge from nowhere. "Do you see those?" she asked, pointing to the marks. Natalie nodded, her brow furrowing. "What do you think made them?" "I don't know," Emma admitted. "But whatever it is, it's not far." Natalie's pace slowed, her hand hovering near the makeshift blade she had strapped to her belt. Emma tightened her grip on the branch she carried, its charred end a reminder of their encounter with the tree. The path took a sharp turn, and as they rounded the bend, the air grew warmer. Not the oppressive heat of the blackened tree, but a strange, unnatural warmth that made Emma's skin prickle. The embankments opened into a clearing, but this one was unlike any they had seen before. The ground was covered in ash, its surface smooth and unbroken except for a single set of footprints leading to the center. There, a figure knelt, shrouded in a tattered cloak that billowed despite the lack of wind. Emma and Natalie froze. The figure didn't move, its head bowed as though in prayer. The footprints leading to it were deep, each one perfectly shaped as though burned into the ash. "Who's there?" Natalie called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Emma stepped forward, her heart hammering. "Hello?" Slowly, the figure rose to its feet. It was taller than Emma had expected, its movements unervingly fluid. The cloak fell away, revealing a gaunt figure with skin like cracked porcelain. Its face was obscured by a mask, its surface smooth and featureless except for two hollow eye sockets that seemed to drink in the light. Emma's breath caught. The figure exuded a presence that was both captivating and terrifying, an aura of power that made her knees weak. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, the movement almost curious. When it spoke, its voice was soft and echoing, as though coming from a great distance. "You do not belong here." Emma gripped the branch tighter. "We're trying to leave." The figure's head tilted in the opposite direction. "There is no leaving. Not without sacrifice." Natalie stepped closer, her fear replaced by anger. "We've done nothing wrong. Let us go." The figure turned its hollow gaze to Natalie. "Wrong? There is no wrong. There is only balance." Emma's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" The figure raised a hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin. It gestured to the ash-covered ground, where shapes began to form. Faces, twisted in anguish, their mouths open in silent screams. "These are the ones who came before you," the figure said. "They sought to leave, to break the cycle. And they paid the price." Natalie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Emma forced herself to look, her chest tightening as she recognized some of the faces. They were the same blurred figures she'd seen in the vortex around the blackened tree. "What do you want from us?" Emma demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. The figure's head tilted back, as though considering her question. "A choice," it said finally. "One stays, one goes." Natalie stepped forward, shaking her head. No, we're not leaving each other behind. The figure's hollow gaze fixed on her. The forest demands balance. For every soul that leaves, another must remain. Emma's mind raced. The forest wasn't just a place. It was alive, a sentient entity that fed on the lives of those who wandered into it. And now it wanted one of them to stay. We'll find another way, Emma said, her voice firm. The figure didn't move. There is no other way. The forest has claimed you. Decide, or it will decide for you. The ash began to stir, swirling around their feet like a living thing. The faces in the ground twisted and shifted, their silent screams growing louder in Emma's mind. Natalie grabbed Emma's arm, her eyes wide with panic. We can't do this. Emma stared at the figure, her mind racing. She thought of Max, of the scarf still tied around her wrist. She had come this far for him, faced the forest's horrors with nothing but sheer determination. She couldn't give up now. I'll stay, Emma said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Natalie turned to her, shaking her head furiously. No, you can't. We'll find another way. The figure raised its hand again, and the ash swirled faster, rising in a vortex around them. The ground trembled, and the faces in the ash screamed silently, their anguish filling Emma's mind. Choose, the figure commanded. Emma looked at Natalie, her heart breaking. She couldn't leave her behind, couldn't ask her to make the sacrifice. But as she opened her mouth to speak, Natalie stepped forward, her jaw set. I'll do it, Natalie said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. No, Emma shouted, grabbing her arm. Natalie smiled weakly. You have to find Max. For both of us. Before Emma could protest, Natalie stepped into the swirling ash. The figure raised its hand, and the vortex consumed her, her form dissolving into the storm. Emma fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. The ash settled, the clearing silent once more. The figure was gone, leaving only the faint warmth of Natalie's sacrifice lingering in the air. Emma clutched the scarf around her wrist, her resolve hardening. She would honor Natalie's sacrifice. She would find Max, and she would escape this cursed forest, no matter what it took. Chapter 10. The storm we didn't see coming. The forest felt emptier than ever. Emma stood at the edge of the ash-strewn clearing, staring at the spot where Natalie had vanished into the swirling void. The silence pressed against her ears, deafening and unrelenting. For the first time since they entered the forest, Emma felt completely alone. She clutched the scarf around her wrist, its familiar texture grounding her. Natalie's sacrifice burned in her mind, her final words echoing like a ghostly bell. Find Max. For both of us. With a deep breath, Emma turned away from the clearing. The path ahead was barely visible, the snow and shadows blending into an indistinct haze. But Emma's resolve was clear. She had to keep moving. The further she walked, the stranger the forest became. The trees no longer grew in chaotic clusters, but stood in unnerving symmetry, their trunks perfectly aligned as if placed by some unseen hand. The ground was unnaturally flat, and the snow beneath her boots felt too smooth, almost polished. Emma's footsteps seemed to echo, a hollow sound that shouldn't exist in an open space. She quickened her pace, each step punctuated by the eerie resonance. It wasn't long before she noticed the bells. At first, they were faint, a distant tinkling that could have been mistaken for the rustling of branches. But as Emma pressed on, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a melody, haunting and melancholic, carried on a wind she couldn't feel. She stopped and looked around, trying to pinpoint the source. The forest was still, the trees casting long shadows in the pale light. The bells seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Hello! she called, her voice trembling. The bells answered, their tones shifting into an almost recognizable tune. Emma's heart raced as the melody stirred a memory she couldn't quite place. It was familiar, achingly so, like a lullaby sung in a dream. She took a hesitant step forward. Who's there? The bells didn't stop. Instead, they grew louder, beckoning her deeper into the forest. Emma hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to turn back, but there was nowhere else to go. Clutching the scarf tighter, she followed the sound. The path twisted and turned, the trees growing denser until their branches formed a canopy that blocked out the faint light of the moon. The air grew colder, each breath forming a cloud that lingered unnaturally long. The bells led her to a small clearing, eerily similar to the one where Natalie had disappeared. In the center stood an ancient bell tower, its stone walls crumbling with age. The structure leaned precariously, its silhouette stark against the dark sky. The bells rang louder now, their sound coming from the tower. Emma approached cautiously, her footsteps crunching on the icy ground. The closer she got, the more the melody twisted, its once haunting beauty turning discordant and grating. She reached the base of the tower and hesitated. The door was ajar, its iron hinges rusted and brittle. She pushed it open, the creak echoing through the hollow structure. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The walls were lined with faded tapestries depicting scenes Emma couldn't fully decipher. Figures cloaked in shadow, their faces obscured, standing beneath a looming bell. At the center of the room, a spiral staircase wound upward into darkness. The bells rang louder now, the sound vibrating through the walls. Emma's chest tightened as she placed a hand on the cold iron railing. The climb felt endless. The staircase seemed to twist in impossible ways, each step steeper than the last. Emma's legs ached, and her breaths came in ragged gasps, but the bells drove her onward. As she neared the top, the air grew warmer, the oppressive heat reminiscent of the blackened tree. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her grip on the railing faltered. Finally, she emerged onto a small platform at the top of the tower. The source of the bells hung before her, a massive iron bell, its surface etched with symbols similar to those on the stones in the forest. The bell swayed gently, though no wind moved it, its haunting melody filling the air. Beneath the bell stood a figure. Emma froze. The figure was shrouded in a cloak like the one she'd seen in the clearing, its face obscured by another featureless mask. But this one was different. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, pulsating in time with the bell's toll. "You have come," the figure said, its voice a low hum that resonated through the tower. Emma's hand tightened around the scarf. "I didn't have a choice." The figure tilted its head, the glow of its eyes intensifying. "There is always a choice. Why are you doing this?" Emma demanded, her voice rising. "Why won't you let me leave?" The figure raised a hand, pointing to the bell. "The toll must be paid. The cycle must continue." Emma took a step back. "I don't understand." The figure gestured again, and the symbols on the bell flared to life, casting the room in a sickly green light. The glow coalesced into an image, a memory. Emma saw herself as a child, running through a snow-covered field with Max chasing after her. Their laughter rang out, pure and carefree. But the scene shifted, darkening. The laughter faded, replaced by cries for help as the snowstorm swallowed them whole. Emma's heart clenched. She remembered that day. It was the last time she'd seen Max before he disappeared. "The forest remembers," the figure said. "It binds those who are lost. Those who seek must pay the toll to reclaim what they have lost." Emma's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "You have walked the path. You have faced the trials. But the forest demands its due. Will you pay the toll?" Emma stared at the bell, its symbols pulsating with unnatural energy. She thought of Max, of Natalie's sacrifice, of the countless faces in the ash. She had come too far to turn back now. "What is the toll?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure extended its hand. "Your most precious memory, the one thing that defines you. Offer it, and you may leave with what you seek." Emma's mind reeled. Her most precious memory? Her time with Max? Her life before the forest? She couldn't imagine losing any of it. But she thought of Natalie, of Max, of the promise she'd made to herself to see this through. Swallowing hard, Emma stepped forward. "I'll pay it," she said, her voice steady. The figure nodded, its hollow eyes glowing brighter. The bell tolled once more, the sound reverberating through Emma's very soul. As the light consumed her, she felt a piece of herself slip away, leaving behind a void she couldn't describe. But as the toll faded, she felt something else, a glimmer of hope. The figure lowered its hand, and the bell fell silent. "The path is open. Go and reclaim what you have lost." Emma turned toward the staircase, her legs trembling. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't stop until she found Max. Behind her, the bell tower dissolved into ash, its haunting melody fading into the night. Chapter 11. A Trail of Glittering Memories. The path that lay before Emma was unlike anything she had encountered in the forest so far. The chaotic wilderness had given way to an eerie stillness, the kind that came after a storm had passed but before the world remembered how to breathe again. The trees, which had once loomed ominously, now stood in perfect lines on either side of a path paved with pristine snow. Their branches reached out like skeletal arms, heavy with icicles that gleamed faintly in the dim light of the moon. Emma's steps felt heavy, her body worn down by the trials she had endured, yet her resolve burned brighter than ever. The memory of Natalie's sacrifice weighed on her, as did the toll she had just paid to the bell tower. The void inside her mind where her most precious memory once resided was a constant, gnawing emptiness. She could no longer recall the warmth of her childhood laughter with Max, but she knew, deep in her bones, that he was still out there, waiting to be found. The snow beneath her boots crunched softly, the only sound in the oppressive silence. The air around her seemed alive with an almost imperceptible hum, as though the forest itself was watching her every move. Emma's eyes scanned the path ahead, wary of traps or illusions that might attempt to turn her back. As she walked, she noticed something strange about the snow. At first, it was just a subtle shift in its texture, the smooth surface marred by faint, swirling patterns that seemed almost intentional. But the further she went, the more distinct the shapes became, delicate, spiraling marks etched into the snow as if by an invisible hand. Emma crouched to examine one of the patterns. It looked like a sigil, its lines precise and fluid, resembling a snowflake that had been twisted and stretched into something alien. The sigil shimmered faintly in the moonlight, as though it held a life of its own. "What are you?" she whispered, her breath forming a cloud in the frigid air. The moment her fingers brushed the edge of the sigil, a sharp jolt shot through her hand, and the air around her shifted. The forest seemed to ripple, the trees swaying though no wind stirred. Emma stumbled backward, her heart racing as the sigil glowed brighter for a moment before fading back into the snow. The hum in the air grew louder, resolving into a series of faint whispers. They were soft at first, indistinct, but as Emma stood frozen in place, she began to make out the words. "Turn back. The path is closed. Leave while you can." The whispers came from all around her, weaving through the trees and swirling in the cold air. Emma clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. "No," she said aloud, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm not turning back." The whispers faltered, as though surprised by her defiance, but they quickly resumed, louder and more insistent. Your journey is futile. The forest will take you, as it has taken the others. Emma took a step forward, then another, ignoring the whispers. She didn't know if they were meant to scare her or if they were genuine warnings, but she couldn't afford to listen. Max was out there, and she was running out of time. The path continued to narrow, the trees pressing closer together until their branches intertwined overhead, forming a tunnel of frost and shadow. The sigils in the snow grew more frequent, their glow brighter and their patterns more intricate. Emma tried to avoid touching them, wary of triggering another ripple, but the path was so narrow that it was nearly impossible. Each time she brushed against one, the whispers grew louder, their words more chaotic and overlapping. "Who are you?" she finally shouted, her frustration boiling over. "What do you want from me?" For a moment, the whispers stopped. The silence was so sudden and complete that it left Emma dizzy, her ears ringing. Then, a single voice spoke, soft and clear, cutting through the void. "We want to protect you." Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was different from the others, calm and almost soothing, with a faint echo that made it seem as though it came from deep within the forest itself. "Protect me from what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "From him," the voice replied. The air grew colder, and Emma's surroundings seemed to darken. The sigils in the snow began to pulse with light, their glow synchronized like the beating of a giant heart. "Who is he?" Emma demanded, but the voice didn't answer. Instead, the whispers returned, louder than ever, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony that made Emma's head spin. She stumbled forward, desperate to escape the oppressive noise, and suddenly found herself in another clearing. This one was unlike the others. The ground was bare, the snow replaced by frozen earth that shimmered with a thin layer of frost. At the center of the clearing stood a massive stone arch, its surface etched with the same sigils that had marked the path. The arch was incomplete, its top broken off as though shattered by some immense force. Emma approached cautiously, the whispers fading into a low hum as she neared the arch. She could feel its power radiating in waves, a pulsing energy that made her skin crawl. As she reached out to touch the stone, the air behind her shifted, and she spun around just in time to see a shadow emerging from the trees. The figure was tall and shrouded in darkness, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. Its eyes glowed faintly, two pinpricks of light that seemed to pierce through Emma's very soul. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. The figure stepped closer, and Emma instinctively raised the charred branch she still carried. "You should not have come this far," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, like the tolling of a great bell. Emma took a step back, her heart pounding. "I don't care what you think. I'm not stopping until I find Mac." The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Max is lost. The forest has claimed him, as it will claim you." "Then why haven't you stopped me?" Emma shot back, her voice rising with defiance. The figure hesitated, its form flickering like a flame caught in a gust of wind. For a moment, Emma thought she saw something human beneath the shadow, a flash of a face, familiar and haunting. "You cannot save him," the figure said, its voice softer now, almost mournful. "But you can save yourself." Emma shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I won't leave him. I won't leave Natalie's sacrifice to mean nothing." The figure's glowing eyes dimmed, and it stepped back into the shadows. "Then may the forest show you mercy," it said, its voice fading as its form dissolved into the darkness. Emma turned back to the arch, her hands trembling as she touched the cold stone. The sigils flared to life, and the arch began to hum, the sound resonating deep in her chest. A rift opened within the arch, a swirling vortex of light and shadow that seemed to lead somewhere beyond the forest. Emma hesitated for only a moment before stepping through, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. As the vortex swallowed her, she thought she heard the whispers again, faint and distant. Beware the heart of the forest. Beware the cost. Then, everything went dark. Chapter 12. Unwrapping the Truth. Emma's eyes blinked open, the world around her shrouded in a dim, amber haze. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like rusted iron. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaky and her breath uneven. She was no longer in the forest. The ground beneath her was no longer snow-covered, but instead comprised an intricate mosaic of stones, each one engraved with symbols similar to those she'd seen in the forest. The stones pulsed faintly, their glow illuminating the space in rhythmic waves. Around her, walls of dark, shimmering crystal rose high into the gloom, twisting and turning into a labyrinth that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Emma turned in a slow circle, her chest tightening as the enormity of the labyrinth became clear. There was no visible sky above, only an endless void that seemed to drink in the light. The faint hum of the sigils returned, a low vibration that filled the air like the distant murmur of a crowd. She clenched the charred branch in her hand, its weight a small comfort in this alien world. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm coming for you." The labyrinth was alive. Every step Emma took seemed to trigger a response, the stones beneath her feet shifting ever so slightly, as if guiding her forward, or perhaps trying to mislead her. The walls glimmered with faint reflections, her own face staring back at her in fragments as she walked. She turned a corner and stopped abruptly. The passage ahead split into 3 paths, each one identical in appearance. The sigils on the ground pulsed with an almost mocking rhythm, offering no clues. Emma stared at the paths, her mind racing. "This isn't real," she murmured to herself, gripping the scarf tied around her wrist. "None of this is real. It's just another test." But the weight of the place, the oppressive silence, made it feel all too real. Emma chose the middle path, her steps cautious. The air grew colder as she ventured deeper into the labyrinth, her breath visible in faint puffs. The walls seemed to close in around her, the crystal surfaces growing darker and more opaque. Then came the whispers. They started softly, a faint murmur that grew louder with each step. Emma froze, straining to hear. The words were indistinct, layered atop one another in a chaotic chorus. She could make out only fragments. Lost, forgotten. The price? Emma gritted her teeth and pressed on, ignoring the whispers. But they grew louder, more insistent, and soon they were accompanied by faint, flickering shapes in the crystal walls. Faces, dozens of them, their expressions twisted in anguish and despair. Emma stopped, her heart pounding as the faces seemed to turn toward her, their mouths moving in silent screams. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice echoing through the labyrinth. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a single voice. "Why do you persist?" Emma spun around, but there was no one there. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, deep and resonant, like the toll of a great bell. "I'm here for my brother," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "I won't leave without him." The voice chuckled, a low, menacing sound that sent chills down her spine. "Your brother is lost, as are you. The forest binds all who enter. There is no escape." Emma clenched her fists. "You're lying. I've made it this far. I'll find him." The laughter faded, replaced by a heavy silence. The faces in the walls disappeared, and the whispers grew faint once more. The labyrinth seemed to stretch endlessly, and time lost all meaning. Emma didn't know how long she had been walking. Minutes, hours, or perhaps days. The only constant was the steady pulsing of the sigils beneath her feet, guiding her deeper into the maze. She encountered strange sights along the way. A pool of liquid silver that reflected her image back at her with a twisted grin. A column of light that rose from the ground to the unseen ceiling, its surface swirling with unrecognizable symbols. And a tree growing in the center of an open chamber, its branches made of pure glass. At one point, she came across a figure hunched over in the middle of the path. Her heart leaped, thinking it might be Max, but as she approached, the figure dissolved into ash, leaving behind only a faint echo of a sob. Finally, Emma reached the center of the labyrinth. The chamber was vast, its walls rising impossibly high and glittering with a dark, malevolent light. At the center of the room stood a massive, pulsating heart, suspended in midair by thick, black tendrils. The heart was made of the same crystalline material as the labyrinth walls, but it glowed with a deep red light, each beat sending ripples through the air. Beneath the heart stood a figure, a man cloaked in shadows, his face obscured by a featureless mask. But Emma recognized the silhouette immediately. "Max!" she cried, running toward him. The man turned slowly, his movements deliberate. As Emma drew closer, she realized something was wrong. The way he stood, the way he moved, it wasn't Max. The figure raised a hand, and Emma was thrown backward by an invisible force. She hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of her. "You should not have come," the figure said, its voice cold and unyielding. Emma pushed herself to her feet, her body aching. "Where is Max?" she demanded. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped aside, revealing a second figure behind it. It was Max. He stood motionless, his eyes vacant and his face pale. Black tendrils extended from the heart above, wrapping around his arms and legs like chains. "Max!" Emma screamed, running toward him. The cloaked figure stepped in her path, blocking her way. "He belongs to the forest now. As do you." Emma's hands trembled as she gripped the charred branch. "I'm not leaving without him." The figure tilted its head, its mask glinting in the red light. "Then you will face the heart." The tendrils around Max tightened, and he let out a strangled cry, his voice weak and broken. Emma's chest burned with fury. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steady. The figure stepped aside, and the heart pulsed violently, its tendrils writhing like living things. Emma stepped forward, the charred branch in her hand glowing faintly as she prepared to face whatever came next. Chapter 13. Shadows at the Edge of the Tree Line. The caravan had become more than just a means of transport. It had become their home. The small, tight-knit world that wrapped around Emma and James had a way of making everything else feel distant, as if the road beyond the trees and the stars was far away. In the last few weeks, the caravan's wooden walls had witnessed more laughter, more whispered conversations, and more confessions than either of them had anticipated. Yet, as the days shortened and the nights grew colder, something unspoken hung between them, a quiet tension that neither of them seemed to fully understand. Every glance shared in the flickering candlelight seemed to carry more weight, and every touch, even accidental, made their hearts race. On that particular evening, as the snow began to fall outside, the world seemed to quiet. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon finally reached them, and the soft, steady drum of snowflakes against the roof filled the silence. It was a rare night in the mountains, when the world seemed to pause, blanketed by the storm, frozen in time. Emma sat by the fire, a mug of spiced cider warming her hands, watching the flames dance in the hearth. She felt the pull of the storm outside, the kind that made everything feel like a secret waiting to be uncovered. "James?" she asked softly, breaking the stillness of the moment. He looked up from the small table where he was adjusting the delicate gears of an old clock. His eyes, dark and serious, met hers. "I've been thinking," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "about the things we haven't said." He put down the clock, his expression unreadable. "Some things aren't easy to say," he replied after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma felt the weight of those words, the lingering truth in them. She knew what he meant. There were feelings between them, feelings that had bloomed without either of them truly acknowledging them. And yet, there was something fragile about it all, as if speaking it aloud might shatter the delicate balance they had built. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks into the chimney. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, but inside, the warmth from the flames and the shared silence was all-encompassing. James took a step closer to her, the space between them narrowing in a way that made Emma's heart race. She could see the storm in his eyes, that familiar intensity, but there was something else there too, something softer, something that made her chest tighten. "I don't know what to do with what I'm feeling," he admitted quietly, the weight of his words settling around them like the snow that now blanketed the ground outside. Emma's pulse quickened. She wanted to reach out to him, to close the gap between them, but there was still a hesitance, a fear of what crossing that line would mean. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," she whispered, her breath coming a little faster. "Sometimes it's enough to just be here, together." The storm outside grew stronger, but in that moment, the world felt impossibly still. Their eyes locked, and time seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for them to make a choice. James finally took that final step, closing the space between them, his hand brushing against hers. It was a small gesture, but it carried with it everything they had yet to say. The fire crackled louder now, the storms howling outside no longer quite as deafening. Everything else seemed to fade away, until there was only the soft sound of their breathing, the warmth of the fire, and the undeniable pull between them. "Maybe we don't need to say it yet," James murmured, his forehead resting gently against hers. "Maybe the snow will tell us when it's time." Emma closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the closeness, the moment, and the quiet promise in his words. The storm outside could rage all it wanted. It would never touch the stillness of the secret they shared in the heart of the caravan. As they sat there, together, with the world outside covered in snow, they both understood. Sometimes, the most profound truths weren't spoken at all. Sometimes, they simply existed, as quiet and inevitable as the snowfall, waiting for the right moment to reveal their beauty. Chapter 14. The Gift of Letting Go. The caravan's wheels groaned against the snow-covered road as they continued their journey through the mountain pass, a stretch of wilderness that felt untouched, even by time itself. The world outside had shifted in ways Emma couldn't fully grasp, as though something invisible had shifted between herself and James. But whatever it was, it had deepened their connection, threading something unspoken between them, something stronger than the storm and the cold, warmer than the fire that still flickered within the caravan. As they moved further into the mountains, the landscape transformed. The trees, now heavier with snow, seemed to reach out toward the caravan, their branches like arms that tried to keep them from venturing too far. Yet, despite the isolation of the place, the further they went, the more peaceful Emma felt. It was as if the mountains themselves were wrapping her in a quiet embrace, sheltering her from the world outside. They had been driving for hours, the road winding up higher into the peaks. The landscape was a study in whites and grays, a beauty so stark it almost seemed unreal. Emma sat by the window, watching the snowflakes drift past, listening to the rhythmic hum of the engine as James guided the caravan through the increasingly dense forest. Despite the stillness, A certain restlessness lingered between them. The words that had been left unspoken since their conversation by the fire were still there, hovering between them, both too important and too fragile to be rushed. Yet Emma knew that something was coming, a moment that would change everything. And so, she waited. James pulled the caravan to a stop as they reached a small clearing, the trees parting to reveal a wide, open expanse of snow. The sky was a deep, dusky purple, the last light of day fading into the horizon. It was then that Emma saw it. Above them, the sky flickered. A soft glow, green and violet, began to dance across the heavens. The northern lights, as beautiful and elusive as a dream, stretched across the sky in ribbons of color, painting the night with their ethereal glow. "It's incredible," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible against the backdrop of silence that had settled over the world. She stepped outside, her boots crunching in the fresh snow, and looked up. The lights shifted in the sky, moving like a living thing, alive with color and grace. She felt the air grow colder, but the chill was nothing compared to the warmth blooming inside her chest. James had followed her out of the caravan, standing beside her without speaking, his gaze fixed on the lights. The faint glow illuminated his face, casting shadows that made his expression unreadable. But Emma didn't need to ask him anything. The moment spoke for itself. The night stretched out before them, vast and endless. The caravan, with its warm light glowing from within, seemed a distant island in a sea of snow. Everything was quiet, save for the distant whisper of the wind and the soft crackling of ice beneath their feet. The stars overhead were brighter now, their light mingling with the colors of the aurora. Emma felt as though she were standing on the edge of a dream, caught between two worlds, one of the past and one that stretched out before her, unknowable but full of possibility. It was in that silence, with the northern lights swirling above them, that James finally spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, a note of uncertainty in it. He shifted slightly, his boots leaving prints in the snow as he turned toward her. "About us. About what happens when we reach the end of this road." Emma felt a flutter in her chest. She had wondered the same thing. The road they had been traveling had stretched out for so long, each mile a step into a future neither of them could predict. But now, with the lights above them and the cold air swirling around them, the question felt heavier than ever. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady even though her heart was racing. "I mean," he paused, as if searching for the right words. "I mean, I don't know what's waiting for us. But I do know this. There's no one else I'd rather be with. No one else I'd trust to walk this road." Emma swallowed, her heart swelling with something she could barely define. She glanced up at the sky, at the lights that were still shifting, their patterns ever-changing, and then back at James. In that moment, something inside her broke free, something she had been holding onto, something fragile and tender. "I feel the same way," she said, the words coming out softer than she intended, but filled with truth. She took a step closer to him, the warmth of his presence more than enough to chase away the cold. James reached out then, his hand brushing against hers, gentle but sure. He didn't say anything more, but the look in his eyes, earnest, full of a quiet resolve, spoke volumes. Neither of them needed to voice it aloud anymore. They had arrived at something that had been waiting for them all along. A moment of recognition, of understanding, of finally realizing that the road they walked was not one that needed to be taken alone. They stood there for a long time, side by side, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. The caravan behind them seemed so small now, so insignificant in comparison to the vast, sweeping beauty of the night. But in a way, it was perfect. The caravan had become their home, but the world outside had become their canvas, waiting for them to paint the rest of their story. The snow continued to fall, soft and unhurried. But Emma felt something change inside her. The feeling of being trapped, of being lost in the uncertainty of the future, was slipping away. With James beside her, under the glow of the northern lights, she finally understood that the journey itself was enough. It didn't matter what the road ahead held, because they would face it together. And as the night deepened, they stood there, hands intertwined, as if the very stars themselves had woven their fates together. Chapter 15. Home at the end of the road. The morning after the northern lights illuminated the sky was colder, sharper. An abrupt contrast to the warmth that had blossomed in Emma's chest the night before. The world around the caravan was quiet, the snow still thick on the ground, a pure, untouched blanket stretching endlessly in every direction. The fire inside had long since dwindled to embers, but Emma could still feel the heat of last night's moment lingering, like a faint warmth in the very air around her. They had spent the night in silence, neither of them needing to speak the words that had hovered between them. There had been no rush to define what had happened. The feeling of belonging, of being together in that moment, was enough. For the first time since she had joined the caravan, Emma felt certain that she was where she needed to be. She sat at the small wooden table by the window, a mug of hot coffee in her hands, watching as the frost on the glass slowly melted in the warmth of the caravan. The day ahead loomed in her mind. Another stretch of road, another place to explore, another unknown waiting for them. But now, it didn't seem so daunting. Whatever the future held, it would come, and she and James would face it side by side. James, as always, was already awake, moving with a quiet precision as he tended to the caravan's engine. There was something about his steady presence that made Emma feel grounded. She watched him for a moment, the way his fingers moved with practiced ease, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was, in many ways, the calm in the storm of her life, and she felt a rush of affection for him, simple and profound. "Morning," he said, without looking up, his voice steady as ever. "Morning," Emma replied, her voice warm despite the chill in the air. She took a sip of her coffee, feeling the heat rush through her. "I was thinking about last night. About everything." James finally looked up, his expression unreadable. He wiped his hands on a rag, then stepped closer to her, the weight of the moment pulling at him. "What were you thinking?" he asked, his tone quiet, like he was giving her space to voice whatever was in her heart. Emma set her mug down on the table, suddenly feeling the enormity of the question. She wasn't sure if she was ready to speak it, but somehow, the words tumbled out anyway. "I don't think I've ever felt so sure of something in my life," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Sure of what I want. Sure of where I'm going." James didn't move. He simply watched her, his gaze steady, searching, but without pressure. "I've always felt like I was drifting," Emma continued, her eyes falling to her hands, where they rested on the edge of the table. "Like I was always waiting for something to tell me where I belonged. I thought I had to find a place, a destination, before I could feel at home. But now I realize it's not about the destination. It's about the journey." James stepped closer, his presence enveloping her like the warmth of the fire that flickered in the hearth. "And you think you found that journey with me?" Emma looked up at him then, meeting his eyes. There was no uncertainty, no doubt in her heart. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "I found it with you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the room was the crackling of the embers in the fireplace and the soft whistling of the wind outside, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Emma could feel her heart beating, slow and steady, as if it had found its rhythm again. This wasn't just about them. It was about a future they were building, one quiet moment at a time. Finally, James reached out, his hand brushing against hers. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to promise anything. The quiet understanding between them was more than words could express. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly, his voice low but filled with sincerity. Emma smiled, her heart full. "I'm glad too." They stood there for a moment, just holding each other's gaze, the silence around them comforting instead of oppressive. Outside, the world was still, waiting, as if the promise of tomorrow had already begun. After a long pause, James spoke again, his voice breaking the quiet but holding a note of anticipation. "We'll need to keep moving. There's still a long road ahead." "I know," Emma said, nodding slowly, "but we'll get there. Together." Together. The word lingered in the air, a soft promise. It wasn't just about the journey anymore. It was about trust, about what they had built together in such a short time, and what they could continue to create side by side. James smiled then, a slow, easy smile that reached his eyes and made Emma's heart flutter. It was a smile full of warmth, full of that quiet certainty that everything would be okay as long as they faced it together. They packed up the caravan in silence, preparing for the next leg of their journey. There was something grounding in the familiar routine, the way their hands worked in unison to ready the caravan for the road ahead. But beneath it all was an unspoken promise, a promise that whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges they might face, they would face them together. The engine roared to life, breaking the stillness of the morning. James glanced over at Emma, his eyes filled with a quiet joy. She smiled back, her heart full of something she couldn't quite define. It wasn't just hope, it was certainty. A certainty that had come in the form of a quiet moment by the fire, a simple touch of hands, and the promise of what was to come. As they drove through the snowy mountains, the path stretching ahead of them, Emma realized that it wasn't the destination that mattered. It was the journey itself. The moments they shared, the things they hadn't yet said but felt deep inside, were enough. The road ahead might be long, and there might be more uncertainty waiting for them, but as long as they were together, Emma knew they could face anything. And so, as the caravan moved forward, disappearing into the endless expanse of snow, they both knew one thing for certain. They were exactly where they needed to be, together, with the promise of tomorrow lighting their way.